I'm so excited to share some updates on our About ML pilot project and how we implemented ML documentation on the ground. And my name is Jiyoo Chang, and I'm a research fellow for the About ML project at the Partnership on AI. And I wanted to mention the team behind the About ML pilot project. We had an amazing team with Kasia Chmielenski, Kristen Custis, and Tina Park. So for those, just wanted to introduce the About ML initiative again. It is a multi-stakeholder initiative that's really bringing together the efforts for machine learning documentation. And we are aggregating a lot of the efforts that are happening across the field and providing a rich resource for practitioners and the community so that they can adopt machine learning documentation in their own workspace. And this work really builds on some of the foundational work that have been happening in the fields listed here. And a lot of research has been proposing some of the templates for describing characteristics of machine learning models, data sets, and systems. And our work really builds on these rich work that are proposing ML documentation. And as you can see here, our pilot, I wanted to give some background and the timeline on how our work evolved, since pilots are built on previous in-depth research and consultations with partners. So in the early days of About ML, around 2018 to 2020, that was when a lot of the foundational work was built. It was definitely a collection of efforts from the partner community and the experts in the space, many of which were mentioned in the previous slide. We had a lot of partner convenings and workshops to really aggregate a rich compendium of resources and guidelines. And some of the examples are the About ML reference document and the resources library, which Josh can share in the link. And this is what the reference document and the resource library looks like on our Partnership on AI website. Would highly encourage you to check it out. And in the past year or two, the research fellows for the About ML project, including myself and Surya, we conducted some original research. So Surya looked into an in-depth review of a lot of the available tools on explainable AI. I think it's over 400 to this date. And I looked at the kind of the qualitative side of implementing documentation from the practitioners through an interview study. And I want to give you kind of a high-level overview of some of the challenges that I heard of implementing documentation on the ground, since a lot of the themes from my research actually showed up in the pilots. So some main categories of the challenges were starting off with like the why. And sometimes because documentation is a effort that requires a buy-in across the organization, from executives to managers to the engineers, it's really important to align people's incentives and kind of align on the why this is important, why this is really important for the organization. Also the how, the tools and the workflows, finding the right tools. As Surya's research shows, there are tons of tools out there, and finding the workflows and tools that really work for that team is very important. There's also a barrier of gathering the information may take a lot of time. Sometimes there's a high turnover of projects. So chasing down the information from, for example, someone who left the company or moved projects can be a challenge. And last bucket of the challenges were kind of the content of documentation, finding the right level of details to include, or finding the right level of technicality in documentation can be challenging for the practitioners. And to the present day is where we have the pilots. So we're at the stage where we're testing a lot of this research that we've been compiling for the past years into practice by implementing some of the best practices with our pilot partners. And wanted to kind of enumerate all the goals that we had for the pilot for About ML. And the first one is to really work closely with our partner organizations to improve their current documentation processes. And these are mostly done through workshops and really analyzing their current artifacts and processes. Second is to understand how the About ML recommendations function in real organization settings. And in order to really understand this, we made sure to gather a lot of data through observation, surveys, interviews, and really documenting the entire process of pilot as the PAI team as well. And lastly, through events like this, sharing our learnings with the greater responsible AI community. And for our pilot partner, we work with Biologit, which is a startup based in Dublin, Ireland. And they're building an AI-driven application that monitors drug safety information from medical journal articles and literature. And they were a really great fit as our pilot partner for several reasons. And first was that the C-level initiative was there. The CTO was very passionate about investing in operationalizing transparency and building really robust documentation practices. As they're in a field that is regulated and preparing for downstream audits, they were very motivated to build good documentation process. And so they had already looked into a lot of guidelines and built a lot of documentation, but they still faced some challenges while they were implementing them on the ground. And lastly, as they were launching their first product, it was a great time to set up some of these best practices. And when we had our initial conversations, these were some of the challenges that the organizations or the questions that they were having. For instance, are current documentation artifacts at the right level of detail? And what is the right level of disclosure of documentation? What is the right way to measure the ROI of documentation? Does the documentation enable the right level of decision making? How do we effectively maintain and update the documentation once it's out there? And how do we ensure that the artifacts are for the right audience? So through the pilot, we really wanted to address some of these challenges and questions. And to give you an overview of the structure, we started out with discussing their current documentation and identifying project and building the plan together, and ran the pilot itself around those issues and challenges. And as mentioned before, our team really documented the effort and the learnings extensively through the process. We had the workshops and check-ins with the team. And after the pilot, we analyzed all our notes and learnings to share our findings through events like this. And as we have more pilots, we are looking to do more cross-pilot findings for broader adoption and creating use cases and guidelines. And in terms of the specific pilot timeline for this particular case, it was about 3 months of time together, 2 to 3 months, and we had a kickoff meeting. At the top are all the meeting points that we had, where we got together virtually and ran workshops every 2 weeks, and also had one-on-ones with the teammates. At the bottom are kind of the asynchronous touch points, where we had them take surveys over the 3 time points, and also fill out weekly diaries to keep in touch. And we wanted to show you kind of the activities and the content that we went over in the workshops. So out of the 4 workshops, we started out with having like an overview and the timeline of their current documentation artifacts. So we mapped out first what part of the machine learning lifecycle was being documented. So, that's kind of a diagram on the top here on the left, on the right, and also align where in the lifecycle these artifacts are mapped to. And I think an interesting observation from this exercise was that, as you can see in the quote here, we noticed that a lot of these documentation artifacts were created ad hoc or basis or on long time after the release. So they noticed that there's a chance of the documentation being missed or getting stale. So I think this kind of exercise of mapping where the artifacts are and when they're created can really show some of the gaps that might be present. In the second workshop, we really focused on the audience. So we really wanted to figure out who is writing which documentation for whom. So as you can see in the diagram here, there might be different types of authors within the company, such as the marketing team or validation, quality assurance experts, the engineers. And for the audience, there might be auditors, prospective clients, and users, or the internal team. And the type of documentation may differ depending on who's writing for whom. So we really wanted to clarify that part and also determine kind of the priority of the artifacts, because there were a lot of different types already. So we really wanted to prioritize. And I think an insightful quote that we heard from this workshop was that if the team grows, so will the audience and the author and the reviewer. So I think having a flexible mindset of this changing landscape is really important, and continuing to assess who is writing for whom is an important part of the process. In the third workshop, we focused on mapping the value of documentation. As I mentioned earlier, aligning the incentives of the team and really understanding the clear why of documentation is very important. So we looked into the values that documentation brings to specific audience. Also, we talked about the success metrics and risks of documentation and how they might connect to responsible AI values. One of the members during this talk, the discussion said, documentation can mitigate the AI adoption risk because poor product docs can lead to dropping of the AI features from use and can potentially lead to misuse of AI, which is a big risk. So through like an example like this, we connected how the success and risk of documentation connects to the bigger picture of responsible AI goals and outcomes. And in our final workshop, we walk through the user journey of some of the key stakeholders around documentation. So on the right here is an example from our mirror board of a journey that a new engineer might have when they are introduced to the team's documentation. So we really mapped out through each process, like the feelings, motivations, or the barriers that they might have as they interact with documentation. And I think it was a really great exercise for the team to kind of develop the empathy and really get in the shoes of the users as they had limited access to some of their customers as they were pre-launch. And at the end of this discussion, a team member shared with us that we might need documentation that is more task specific, matches people's understanding of AI, or otherwise educates them, uses the right language, etc. As of now, it may be geared towards the data science community in scope and terminology. So it's a great way to understand how accessible or legible documentation might be for the user and really think from their perspective. So all these contents were kind of pilot materials that were very specifically catered to our pilot partner. But I wanted to kind of share some of the key takeaways that may apply to more broader context at other organizations. First, I think it's very important that building a shared understanding on the why of documentation is critical. And this can be done by connecting the team to the larger goals and the values of the organization. So documentation, not just for the sake of documenting, but how it connects to transparency or accountability. I think talking about those values can help the members have more incentives to document, and also thinking about the values that it brings to specific users can be an exercise. Secondly, clarifying the intended audience and their needs. So understanding who the documentation is for really determines how the documentation is written. So as shown in previous exercises, mapping out the user journeys, also gathering direct feedback from users as early as possible, and also keeping a flexible mindset that the audience or the landscape might change. And lastly, communicating and coordinating internal processes. So determining who in the organization is documenting what, also building in structured checkpoints to align the team on where the documentation is at as an organization, and also covering the machine learning lifecycle comprehensively and making sure there aren't a lot of gaps in the coverage can be an important tool for the team.